Hello, everyone, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live all about the Neurodivergent Job Seeker. I've got some hot news to start us off today. Very excited about this. I'm going to bring it up onto the screen just to let everybody know that today, this session is 1080's 100th LinkedIn Live session. So well done, everybody that's been a guest, hosted the sessions. It's my absolute privilege to be in the hot seat for the 100th one, and I've got a great couple of guests, so I'm going to hide that and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So first of all, Hannah, tell us all about yourself.
Thank you, Dean. And very excited to be here on the 100th LinkedIn Live, which is a great achievement. So a little bit about myself. I've worked for 1080 now for the last 12 years as a career coach and as well as an account manager working in the business. But to be honest, my passion is absolutely been in the career space. I think everyone should have a job that they love. I think there would be nothing worse, that Sunday night feeling, thinking I can't bear to get up and go to bed. So, I mean, that is my driver. A bit of background is I actually started my career working with vulnerable adults and people with learning disabilities gaining employment. And I used to work with individuals to support them into roles. I used to do a whole piece around what they wanted to achieve, what success looks like, and working them into roles that for them suited their capabilities and what they really love doing. And I did that for 6 years and I loved it. It was really rewarding. I really enjoyed it. I did things from profiling, helping people find the jobs, travel training, so anything you could imagine. And one of the key parts of the job was this piece around sculpting the job. So what are the skills you have and the things you like doing, and let's find a job and sculpt that around you. I mean, ultimately, I have to say, Dean, something I think every employer should do, because there are things all of us struggle with or maybe don't do as well. And I have to say, I avoid those myself. That's a little bit about me.
Surely not. Amy, please introduce yourself, those that have not met you. This is your first LinkedIn Live, so being on the 100th one is a good one to
I know, very special. So I feel quite honoured, privileged. So thank you very much for having me. So yes, I'm Amy Rusby. I have set up a company called Neurodiversity Plus. My background, just before I tell you a bit more about the company, is that I'm a health professional by background. I'm a neurophysio, so I've spent 20-something years doing rehab with people after strokes and brain injuries, that kind of thing. I was in private practice doing that, had my own business for that length of time, having worked first for a few years in the NHS. And then when COVID happened, I was unable to do that job because I was visiting people within their own homes, and obviously it wasn't particularly appropriate to be going and doing that, particularly when most of my patients were in the vulnerable group. So I waited for about a year because we didn't know how long it was going to be that the COVID restrictions were in place. And then I got a job employed by a big company that contracts to the DWP, and I was acting as a disability assessor for about 2.5 years. And because I was having a new kind of direction in my career at that point, not particularly through choice, but just the circumstances, I thought it would be a really good opportunity to diversify into something that I haven't spent a lot of time working with, which was mental health. And doing the assessments within that time, I just found that there were so many people struggling with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and they really didn't know what was available to them to get help, who was available to help them, what kind of support they needed even. And so that was when I founded Neurodiversity Plus. So we support students, so we do tuition packages, but obviously more relevant to this webinar is that we do also support people to bridge that gap between education and employment. And employment is obviously sort of a broad sense, so working in a working environment, and that could be voluntary, it could be part-time, full-time, charity work, whatever, but we support people to go about it in the best way and to get them the best results.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you for that, both of you. What I'd like to do is I'm going to kick off with our first question that I'm going to bring onto the screen. And Amy, I think we'll start with you on this one. So what is neurodiversity? That's the first bit. And how do we think that impacts on the job search? So what's your thoughts on that?
So neurodiversity is really, I always think of it as a broad term that encompasses, it's like a range, a massive range of the way that people's brains function. So I believe we're all on the spectrum somewhere, but it's just a case of where. So for some people who are kind of further along the spectrum, they may have traits that are common to everyone, but maybe a bit more exaggerated in those people. And so some of those traits are things like poor motivation, poor focus, poor concentration, like limited, not always poor. Again, it's sort of like some people might be just a little bit affected with it, other people might be hugely affected. So, you know, it is a range. But focus and concentration is a big area, obviously, when people are searching for work, because it can impact, obviously, sort of, you know, once they get beyond the job search into the workplace itself, but it can also really impact them with the job search itself, because obviously if they're having limited sort of time periods of concentration, it's very difficult to exactly kind of know where to start and how to use those periods of concentration that they have and focus. So it's a lot of that as well is connected with time management as well, which some people with neurodivergence can be affected by as well. It's sort of planning and organization can be a bit difficult and a bit of a challenge. In terms of their sort of mental health aside, because neurodivergence isn't technically mental health, but there's a lot of things that kind of come along in with it that would be considered more mental health, and anxiety can be one of those big factors. And so that can impact somebody again in terms of kind of how they feel about it, whether they're going to avoid, whether they're going to you know, sort of just really struggle in terms of their communication, because that's another big area where people are often struggling because they can't necessarily express. It's not that they can't express themselves or they can't sort of think of answers to people when people talk to them, but they sometimes need a lot longer time to sort of process that information. Okay. And so I think then it can be very difficult for people to you know, they're nervous about interviews because they could be misunderstood. They're nervous about interviews because they're afraid that, you know, for some people, they'll be asked a question and they'll just be formulating the answer in their mind. And then the interviewer will think, well, we haven't got much time, we'll move on. And they'll go on to the next thing. And it's sort of like, hang on a minute, I've only just kind of got together with that question. And it's almost like they're just their brain feels like it's being bombarded with layer after layer of things that are distractions then, rather than actual focus of, you know, what they're supposed to be saying. And then obviously that feeds into the anxiety, and it's sort of a vicious cycle.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Hannah, let's have some thoughts from you on there. There's so much. This is definitely one of those subjects. I say this every time I run a LinkedIn live session. This is definitely one of those subjects that we could talk about for a lot longer than the 30 minutes. And I had to, everyone watching today, I had to apologize to Hannah and Amy in advance in case I had to shut them up, and in that and the nicest possible way. But it was because I knew there's so much to cover. So Hannah, go. Tell us your thoughts.
Thank you, Dean. And I think, to be honest, just highlighting what Amy said, I do think it is the thing of it's how you think, and I think neurodiversity really is how we all think differently, but it may be that you think differently to somebody else, or as I would say, if you were neurotypical. I think one of my beliefs is we shouldn't think too much about how you are different, but acknowledge those differences and then use them in order to kind of look at how it might be impacting you, how it might be potentially holding you back. So I thought back on my experience and kind of the impact I saw when I worked with people when they were applying for jobs. And typically the things I would see is kind of procrastination. So not even thinking about it because actually they're too worried to start the job search. That would be something I quite often saw. Other things were, not wanting to get the interview. So would actually write applications and CVs that didn't suit the job, because that fear of interview drove that desire not to be submitted, but they were ticking a box and I've applied for a job, so that's a good thing. Other things I saw were kind of self-destructive behavior. I'm not good enough, I can't do this, I can't focus. And it's those horrible, horrible thoughts and feelings that don't help us and in fact hold us back. I think it can impact how you see yourself, but how others potentially see us, because actually what we're projecting is there. I also think it can affect you in terms of like spending time on yourself, because if you're finding it difficult, you won't want to sit down and research and understand, more about yourself and those roles, because that fear almost like keeps you still. So they're kind of the biggest impacts I saw when working with people. But the reality is a lot of it had a massive impact on confidence, which actually stopped people moving forward.
I think Amy was saying like it's a vicious circle, and actually when you piece together what both of you are saying, it's almost like ever decreasing circles of that vicious circle, just sort of gradually just bringing somebody, almost detracting them further and further away from what they can do and being more limited by the aspects of how the neurodivergent presents itself for them personally.
Absolutely.
I guess, go on, sorry.
And the reason I think we've highlighted the impacts is because we want you to know and be reassured that actually these feelings are quite normal in terms of, that holding yourself back or not applying. So actually we wanted to address that at the outset, because that can be the biggest thing that's holding the job search back.
Okay. And I think the fact as well that, as you say, that is normal to have those feelings. So that's, when I was saying we're all on the spectrum somewhere, everybody goes through those emotions and those fears and those anxieties, but it's just perhaps a bit more concentrated, and it's the way of sort of accessing the best way to manage those feelings and how to go about it in the way that's best, obviously, for the result of getting a job, but also in terms of looking after yourself as well.
Okay. And that's where things like that avoidance come in. Hannah, you were talking about almost self-sabotage to avoid getting the interview, because then that way you are there's less disappointment of going for the interview and not getting it if you don't get to the interview in the first place. But actually that's that self-sabotage creeping in. I guess one of the questions, and this is our next question that feeds on really, really nicely from those discussions, is, well, okay, is it okay to tell a prospective employer about being neurodiverse? Hannah, perhaps we'll stay with you on this one. What's your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so my sense is it's personal choice, but I do think everybody should lead by sharing what their strengths are and then things that they might find potentially challenging. I think at the outset, it allows the individual that's potentially reading our CV, looking at a job application or interview, can get a real sense for who we are. Because my argument here is, I wouldn't want to work for a business that didn't care about me and what was important to me and how I behaved if they don't want to know. I don't want to be there. I don't want to bring myself to work. So there's a piece that says, I think it's the best piece is to share who you are and what's important to you and what your strengths are. I don't think you necessarily need to say all the things you find difficult, but I definitely think if you feel it will help you and help the business accommodate you and your needs, definitely. Amy, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the big things that I try to get across with my clients is that there, whilst, yes, obviously there are challenges, otherwise we wouldn't be supporting them, but there are a lot of positives as well. And I think that the way to go about it is not to kind of say, oh, I'm neurodivergent, so I have this problem, and make it a negative. It would be more, you don't even have to use the word neurodivergent or autistic or have ADHD or whatever, but just say it as a characteristic, or as, see you as you and not as a label. It doesn't matter what it's called. This is how I am as a person. I work better in this environment, or I work better in that environment. And I think that by telling the employer and putting it in that way, if they are a good employer and if they are genuinely, as you say, interested in that individual, and that they would be not just the employee being a good fit for them, but the other way around as well. It has to be a two-way thing. And if that's the case, then the employer might then pick up on those, okay, so you said you work better in this environment. Can you tell me a bit more about that? And then it can kind of lead on to further conversation. And I think as well, it's really important from the point of view of putting any sort of adjustments in place as well, because if the employer isn't aware, then they're not going to know to help you or support you. And that can obviously lead on to further anxiety, because things can go wrong and you don't know, it's like, oh, should I say or should I not? And if you haven't said in the first place, it's kind of like makes it a bit awkward to then know when to bring it up. So I think my sort of summary on the answer to that question is I would tell the employer, but I wouldn't necessarily make it like, as I say, a condition as such. I'd just say, this is me, this is how I work. And I would also add to that it's really important to say what doesn't help as well as what does help.
Yeah.
Because I think that sometimes, you can kind of get so absorbed and focused on what might help somebody, but you could be doing something that's really unhelpful, completely unaware. And so I think that that's really important as well, for people to be able to kind of voice and be, it's very easy to sort of say it, and then when you're in that situation with anxiety on top of all of that, it's really hard to actually do. But I think that's why, if you kind of like, even in your application, put, not labeling anything, but just saying, this is how I do or don't prefer things, or, whatever, so that you are almost setting the scene for yourself. So you're kind of empowering yourself to control your own environment.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think there's a point there as well about, you're saying, it's almost about finding what your superpower is as well. So absolutely. Like, there's that piece that says, okay, so these are the things I might find trickier, and I don't want you to think it will lead to X, Y, and Z, but actually things that I find really interesting almost are like a superpower. So I might have attention to detail or research skills that maybe no one else does. I'll have a different way of thinking about things. So actually your ideas will be stronger because I might come at it from a different perspective. So that misconception that maybe because I may not be able to concentrate as long is wrong, because actually what that means is my brain will very much focus on what's important at the time, and we can then make decisions. So
I think what you both focus in there on is going back to something that you said earlier, Hannah, about, what's my strengths? Actually, it's let's try and redefine and take some time to think about, these are the challenges I have, but this is how do you turn that into a positive that's a strength, that actually this is what this means to you, this is what you'll get from me, this is the benefit of that. And it's almost, I wouldn't say using the difficulty, and I don't mean that in a in the wrong way. It's about seeing where does the strength come from that, and what does that mean to the employer. We've had a really good question from Liz that I'm going to briefly show on the screen, but our next couple of questions are probably going to cover those areas. So, but Liz, I didn't want to not acknowledge a great question around what are some of the common challenges neurodivergent job seekers face during the recruitment process, and how can employers better accommodate these needs. And our next question was around that support. So what does support actually look like? And Amy, let's stay with you for this one. You were on a roll, so we'll continue that roll. What does support look like if I'm an employer, and I'm looking to recruit somebody, and they've either told me directly, or they've talked about some of the challenges, or what works for them, what doesn't work for them. What should I be doing? What's the support look like, do we think?
So I think I tend to look at it in breaking it down between emotional and practical support, because I think both are really equally important, whether you want to call it emotional or psychological support, same thing really. I think, it's very, very important for both the employer and the employee to be aware of that aspect. It's not just practical things, it's also having the support in place in terms of like regular check-ins with the employer. I think though that needs to be proactive check-ins. There's no point in somebody, an employer just saying, oh, how are you doing? How are you managing? The employee, feels very, almost very vulnerable really, because they're sort of in a position where they're sort of laying themselves open to talk about things which often people find very difficult. And then if as a result of doing that, the employer doesn't act on anything, it is almost sort of self-defeating for the employee to actually open up in the first place. So I think that it definitely needs to be something that everyone is kind of on board with. And I think that, as I say, that's people are going to be a lot more productive if they're emotionally looked after, as well as if they've got practical support.
I almost want people to sort of say, well, when you are any employee, is do what you say you're going to do.
Exactly.
Because you are, there's a certain amount of, when you are recruiting for a position, you've got to sell your business to that person to make them want to accept the position, whoever they are. And there is a certain amount of assurances and conversations around what your first months will look like. Sometimes there's a disconnect between what that actually looks like, or what actually happens. And I think so for me, that part of that support has got to be do what you said you were going to do as well.
I completely agree. And I think that particularly for people with autism as well, if they have, they take things very literally sometimes. And if you say you're going to do something at 4 o'clock and you don't do it at 4 o'clock, that can really throw somebody. And it's not even, just the fact that, oh, well, they're a bit disappointed because that was said that was going to happen and it didn't. It's actually, it can throw them completely. It can put people into a meltdown sometimes, because they've structured their routine around what has been said to be happening, and that can be vital. So I think there's a real need with the employers to recognize that, but also to be adaptable and flexible in terms of what they can offer. So say, for example, somebody finds it really difficult, like we were saying earlier, they might have difficulties with time management. So it might be that they're constantly turning up for work late. Well, again, this is where it goes back to, should I say anything about why I'm coming in late? Because it could be seen as a disciplinary action. But if they understand why you're coming in late, and that when you get there, you might have had to deal with public transport, that is a real stress and a real, really, really big challenge for a lot of people with neurodivergence, then there's more understanding. They might perhaps be able to, either if it's a case of you haven't got your own transport, they might be able to set up a car sharing scheme or something like that. Or it might be that they can let you have more flexible working hours, so you don't have to go on the bus at the peak time, and you can have a little bit less stress getting there, and then sort of make the hours up later in the day or something. It might be that there's sort of HR support put in place with something like a peer at work, another colleague that you can kind of confide in or have support from. So I think that there are all those aspects. There's also the practical support in terms of equipment provision, because often there's a lot of software programs that can help people for things like if people have dyslexia, things like coloured overlays.
I've seen them, like it is literally almost like a shaded filter in effect, isn't it, on the screen? Yeah.
And it really calms. It kind of it's sort of almost like a filter, so it cuts out because with neurodivergence of any description, there's often kind of a lot of background noise that is kind of so distracting, and it detracts the attention away from the thing that you're trying to focus on. So by having these kind of bits of equipment provided, it can just make you really much more productive as well. And obviously then that's a positive thing for going forward into not just maintaining your job, but also promotion and moving forward as well.
Hannah, what would you add in terms of support?
I mean, truthfully, there's not a lot to add in terms of the individual's report, but a couple of things I do think is it's important that your external network, friends, family, community groups, etc., that you have access to them, and you share, what it is you're trying to achieve and how you're trying to achieve it. I also think in terms of the organisation, things like asking somebody what it is they need and how they can support, but also maybe have, for example, like checkpoints, or do training around neurodiversity, or look at things like this, because in terms of the organisation, that will help everybody understand and kind of work together. So they're the kind of two things.
Okay, brilliant. We are rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to bring up this question. Who knew we would run out of time? So, Hannah, what practical advice can you offer the neurodivergent job seeker?
So there are a couple of things that I think really, really help. So one of them is to have kind of like a personal profile. Understand yourself, understand your strengths, and share that, and make that part of your job search. Have an action plan. I think everybody should have an action plan. That doesn't mean if you don't meet your objectives that you've set that day, you punish yourself, you just move them to the next day. But give yourself some structure, because then you can start to celebrate when you've achieved something, which is my next point. Celebrate success. It doesn't matter how small it is. It might be just looking for jobs, but celebrate them, because that will make you feel very differently about yourself and your confidence. Look for support in others. That's really important. And then things like reflective logs or anxiety management, like reflection, meditation, calm spaces. So we know these things help us all to be more focused, but I definitely think they will help.
Okay, brilliant. Amy, you got 3 seconds.
Yeah, what she said. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And just try and, like we said before, be as positive as possible, and value what you can offer as you.
And I do just want to say my one final thing and this is my top tip for anyone, but be you. There you go, Dean. Be you and enjoy this journey. It might be challenging, but celebrate what successes you've had and what you've learned. And that is the case for anybody. Celebrate that.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Any other top tips from you, Amy? I'll give you another 3 seconds. Look.
I think also going back to what Hannah said about sort of having a plan, and for some people that might be a list. For some people it might be sort of, you know, a list in the form of bullet point words. For some people it might be sort of, you know, pictures or images, whatever it is, but have that list so you've got something visual that you can see your progress. Tick it off, use highlighter pens, whatever you want to do, whatever works for you to make it that bit more interesting, that will sort of almost stick in your mind as achieving. And then, as Hannah said, look after yourself, make sure you eat well, sleep well, reduce anxiety as much as you can, and just really sort of try to put the attention on what you can offer. And, you know, as Hannah said right at the beginning, enjoying what you do, because I think especially, well, for anyone, to be honest, if it's something that you enjoy, the attention on that and the focus on that is going to be much better anyway.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, marvelous. Thank you both. It's been an absolute joy to do the 100th session with you. Just to give everybody a bit of a hint as to where we're going with our second 100, number 101, our next session is on the European job market, getting a job overseas. That's on Tuesday, the 8th of October. So mark that as a date in your diary. From my point of view, I just want to say thank you, Hannah and Amy, for spending time with me today, but also in the build up today. It's been great working with you on both on this session. I'm going to end the stream now, everybody, but do continue the conversation on LinkedIn if you wish to do so. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.